Dr. Maria Power, um, who has spoken to Faith in Europe before a few years ago, who is Senior Research Fellow in Human Dignity at Blackfriars, part of the Las Casas Institute in Oxford. She also teaches on our MA programme in Catholic Social Teaching, for which I'm responsible at St Mary's University. And quite a lot of attention has been received in relation to the book that she co-edited last year, which is why we've invited her along this afternoon to speak to us about the issues raised in the book. So I'll now hand over to her. Maria, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm just going to share my screen. And right, and then right. Okay, can everyone see that? Brilliant, thank you. So, rise up, O Lord, and may thy enemies be dispersed, and those who hate thee be driven from thy face. Oh, hang on, I'm having, oh, sorry, just, These words from Psalm 67 were placed on the top of a chapter of the 1,500-page manifesto of Anders Breivik. Breivik, as you may recall, went on to murder 77 people, mainly teenagers, in Oslo and Utøya Island in 2011. His manifesto also stated this: you can either choose to learn how to rise up in the power of your Lord and Saviour and learn how to become a true warrior in the Lord, or you can continue to keep your head in the sand, and oppressor after oppressor will keep beating you down. Tragically, this is not the only example that I could provide of the misuse of scripture or of Christian ideas to promote violence. In this seminar, I want to give you some examples of how right-wing extremists, are using scripture, and offer some ideas about how we, as Christians, might respond to this. But first, I want to give you some more examples from beyond the UK. In Hungary, Viktor Orban has positioned himself as the defender of Christianity against a dangerous influx of Islam, who are arriving with refugees from the Middle East. He says, the masses arriving from other civilizations endanger our way of life, our culture, our customs, and our Christian traditions. In Spain, the far-right populist movement Vox, led by Santiago Abascal, models himself on Francisco Franco and Viktor Orban, is on record with these words: our identity, and that of the whole of Europe, is Christian. And that must be preserved, because our values are superior and dignify man. I do not want the Islamization of Europe, because it goes against who we are. It goes against the best of us. As the influence of Christian nationalism has grown across Europe, the Christian faith has been used as an excuse for resisting migrancy, sometimes violently. This is a screen grab from a few years ago, where the inhabitants of the Greek island of Lesbos, which admittedly has been hugely and disproportionately affected by the migrant crisis, were seen pushing a boat of refugees back out to sea with the cry, "We're Christians here, you're not welcome." The next image is reportedly of an Orthodox priest patrolling the Greek-Turkish border, prepared to repel with violence the refugees who were attempting to cross it. And we should also look to the West. In the United States, we have seen an extraordinary commingling of religious and political language, sometimes amounting to near idolatry. During the 2020 presidential campaign, Vice President Mike Pence intentionally misquoted the book of Hebrews. Let us run the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Old Glory and all she represents. Let us fix our eyes on this land of heroes and let their courage inspire. Let us fix our eyes on the author and perfecter of our faith and freedom. And never forget that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So there we see the insertion of the words Old Glory, and Old Glory is a nickname for the American flag. Here are some more recent screen grabs from social media, selected to show the tight association in many American minds between patriotism and God. This one makes a blasphemous association between the sacrificial love of Jesus Christ, crucified, the American flag, and the gun. But back to the UK. In the lead up to the 2015 general election, the UKIP published what they called a Christian manifesto, headed with the title Valuing Our Christian Heritage. In its foreword, the party's then leader, Nigel Farage, wrote, Britain needs a much more muscular defence of our Christian heritage and our Christian constitution. In parts of the British Church, a much more muscular defence is what we actually seem to be getting. On April the 5th this year, which was during Ramadan, Bristol Cathedral hosted a grand iftar, inviting any citizen who wished to join with local Muslims as they broke their fast after sunset. Large crowds gathered on College Green, just outside the cathedral, and also in the building itself. I have seen no suggestion that any act of worship was carried out. But video footage from the event simply shows people, many but not all in Muslim dress, enjoying food together, with children playing alongside their families. Commentators immediately took to their microphones and keyboards to denounce this. One of them is an ordained priest, who is a prominent influencer with about 1/3 followers on Twitter. He took it as a sign that we are living in the Islamic Caliphate of Great Britain. That particular Twitter thread attracted over 6,000 readers, with many people chipping in to call for, quote, defence of our land, exorcism of the cathedral, and most disturbingly, for crusade. But this sort of thing is not confined to political posturing or social media rants. In 2014, members of the organisation Britain First invaded mosques across the UK with army-issued Bibles. The intruders called it a Christian campaign, and in the following 2 years, Britain First members made a habit of parading through Muslim majority areas of several British cities, aggressively flourishing large crosses. Following a series of similar incidents, the 2 leaders of the organisation were jailed in 2018 for religiously aggravated harassment. The far right of British politics is found in a wide variety of forms, ranging from now-banned organisations such as the neo-Nazi National Action to elements within mainstream politics. So terminology is tricky. One of the leading specialists on far-right movements, Cass Muda, defines the far right as those on the right who are anti-system, which he defines as being hostile to liberal democracy. He then divides that into 2 subgroups. The extreme right, which rejects the essence of democracy, that is popular sovereignty and majority rule. Examples of this include Hitler and Mussolini. By contrast, the radical right accepts the essence of democracy, but fundamentally opposes elements of liberal democracy, most notably minority rights, the rule of law, and the separation of powers. Because the terminology is so slippery, we tend to use the term right-wing extremism. Happily, the more extreme versions of this ideology are struggling to gain purchase in the UK at present, but we should not be complacent. Because as we have seen, many countries in the rest of Europe and beyond have not proved so immune. But within the UK, mainstream forms of the far-right movement are growing in influence and plausibility. The 2024 report by Hope Not Hate plots a significant advance, even in the past year, both within fringe political movements and within the Conservative Party itself, as well as in popular news outlets such as GB News. The mainstreaming of the far-right discourse makes it more acceptable and more electable, and as we shall see shortly, more plausible to the church. Arguably, it is especially when it operates within the mainstream that the movement presents a very real danger to minorities within society. In recent years, the Overton window has shifted considerably to the right, permitting many prominent individuals, not least two consecutive Home Secretaries, to express views and use rhetoric which 20 years ago would have been unthinkable. So at this point, I should attempt to list the key ideological figures which mark these movements. However, this is not a tidy, self-contained catalogue. Different groups will emphasise different things, and some right-wing extremist groups hold diametrically opposed views on certain issues. An indicative list of ideologies would generally include a cluster of some or all of the following. First, a nationalistic urge, tending towards ethnic or Christian nationalism or even white supremacy, which may be expressed as racist abuse or violence. Related to this, there is often a strong anti-migrant invective, often employing dog whistle racism. Next, we have traditional ethics around human sexuality and gender, which in the hands of far-right groups can manifest as homophobic or transphobic violence, the picketing of abortion clinics, and the promotion of rhetoric which oppresses, controls, or objectifies women. Fourth, anti-Semitism. This is a variable element, especially since the 7th of October, and some right-wing extremist groups are aggressively Zionist. Fifth, Islamophobia. In its various forms, this is a relatively uniform element of far-right political expressions in this country. Finally, conspiracisms, such as climate change denial, anti-vaxxing, and the belief that Jewish control over global banks and media. As an indication of the prevalence of these conspiracy theories, in a recent poll of 25,000 members of the general public, and I emphasise here it's the general public, conducted by the organisation Hope Not Hate, found that each of these conspiracisms were given credence by between 12 and 34% of respondents. And again, I want to emphasise to you that this is just the general public. It was a random poll. So now you've probably spotted that some of these themes are appealing to Christians, and in fact they may intersect with what we might consider politically perfectly legitimate concerns. The idea of cleaning up the morality of society is appealing to many who mourn the national decline in ethical standards. The right's restoration of family values has links with the authentic biblical themes of fidelity and covenant love. The recovery of a Christian past in the face of the threat posed by Muslim immigrants appeals to a fear of persecution, which is perfectly legitimate in some overseas contexts, along with the faithful desire to see one true God worshipped. For these reasons, such views are not niche in the church. A survey conducted by the Pew Research Centre in 2018, which we're hoping will be repeated soon, surveyed attitudes of Christians in 15 Western European countries, including the UK. In response to the statement, "Our people are not perfect, but our culture is superior to others," 54% of church-attending Christians agreed, compared to 45% in the overall UK population. A second statement, that it is very or somewhat important to have a British or English family background to be truly British or English, generated a 72% agreement from church attending Christians, compared with 53% in the overall population. So these may feel like worthwhile aims to many Christians when they hear such policies or rhetoric being offered. But while they may fail to appreciate is that the motifs are somewhat being cynically employed for a darker purpose by those whose allegiance and values are quite contrary to Christian ones. Notice this troubling quotation from a member of the extreme right-wing group Occidental Dissent. The alt-right shouldn't get hung up on being anti-Christian because Christianity is infinitely malleable. After we seize power and get on television, the alt-right will be celebrated as Christian. So, in 2020, Hannah Stroman, a scholar of biblical reception, and Ulrich Schmeidel, a theologian, published a book called The Claim to Christianity. In the book, they examine the theological claims made by 4 different far-right groups in Europe. They say this: trained theologians might not like these political readings of the Bible. Biblical scholars might say that they are historically implausible, that they are hermeneutically incorrect, or that they are willfully wrong. But these readings are still there. The theologies that run through the far right didn't appear out of nowhere. This is a challenging suggestion. Stroman and Schmeidel are challenging the church to stop disavowing the issue as someone else's problem and to face up to the uncomfortable fact that it is Christian adjacent theology that lies behind some of these movements. So what can we as Christians do about it? In May of 2023, Helen, my co-editor, and I were successful in gaining British Academy funding. And we gathered together a group of 14 invited participants for a 24-hour consultation, which we conducted at Bristol Baptist College. They represented, as you can see, an international and interdisciplinary group with experts in a variety of fields, alongside those with on-the-ground experience of helping the church respond to the democratic threat by extremist groups. We were moderately racially diverse, but regret, due to circumstances beyond our control, our Black contributor was unable to participate at the last moment. Our task was to consider how the UK church should respond to the rise of the radical right. And our discussions are represented in a book published last August called The Church, the Far Right, and the Claim to Christianity. At the end of the book is a concluding chapter where we reflect on the conversations and attempt to draw together some of the common themes and strands. Out of these discussions, Helen has distilled 10 concrete recommendations for the UK church, and I will now summarise them in brief, except one of the recommendations I've rewritten to reflect my identity as a Catholic. So, first, the church must own up to, rather than attempt to conceal, our own historic and indeed our contemporary complicity with racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. We need to be honest about the times we have got it badly wrong, whether it was done through a theology that we would utterly abhor, or whether the rhetoric lies uncomfortably close to our own theological position. We need to notice the ways that our scripture can seek to promote such ideologies when incautiously or cynically interpreted. We must therefore take care in the pulpit, for example, that we don't unwittingly collude with these ideas. This sort of cautious, humble, and non-defensive stance is a first vital step towards cultivating a faithful and a useful response to the problem. Second, we had a long discussion about the importance of repudiating violent acts done in the name of Christian theology. And our Muslim colleague in the room was particularly helpful about this. While we had appreciated the importance of not allowing such actions to go unchallenged or to pass without comment, we realised that these expectations put a lot of pressure on individuals. Muslims in particular live with a public expectation that each individual or any small organisation of whatever purpose should make a public disavowal of Islamist terrorism every time such an event occurs. Christians aren't expected to do this. Our conclusion was that the disavowal of violence perpetrated in the name of the church is an important public act, but the responsibility lies with denominational leaders and other thought leaders rather than with every individual church member. Next. The church should be wary of reinforcing far-right stereotypes of Muslim illiberality, which it may unwittingly do by positioning itself as the primary upholder of democratic dialogue. Sometimes the urge to stand in neutrality, to hold open spaces where all people of goodwill can meet to dialogue, implicitly positions the church as the prime upholder of democratic values and positions others, such as Muslims, as the beneficiaries of that at best, or at worst, as threats. Fourth, emerging from an extended discussion of the parable of the Good Samaritan, we explored the idea about dialoguing with the bandits, which is a phrase Helen always credits me with, but which I actually borrowed from Pope Francis. Many of us will have the commendable instinct to dialogue with those on the far right, to try and persuade them to more moderate ways of thinking. But when we do seek to do this, we need to be aware of the danger that our good intentions and neutral spaces might be hijacked by bad actors. Those in the group with direct experience of attempting this are very insistent that some bad actors can be supreme time wasters, preying on the good intentions of others, and thoroughly enjoying themselves as they wind everyone up. Such problems can be partly countered by agreeing the rules of engagement in advance and then enforcing them. We also need to realise that the task of de-radicalisation is a specialist role. Akin to providing medical care or offering specialist counselling, it does not fall within the remit or skill set of most ministers. And when we do convene dialogue, we need to model the virtue of healthy disagreement and train our congregations in these virtues. It helps nobody if we become like those we oppose, mirroring their violent rhetoric with our own. Fifth, we need to seek and propagate rich and nuanced understanding of the causes of far-right movements and avoid demonising certain demographic groups as pervasively racist. For example, it is increasingly clear that many of the people engaged in extreme right-wing movements at the moment are wealthy, hedge fund managers and stockbrokers and the like. There is plenty of dark money funding these movements, and it's not coming from council estates. And the recent Channel 4 documentary on Hope Not Hate illustrated this very, very clearly. At the same time, we need to be more attentive to the factors which can drive far-right ideology among deprived groups, and view that problem as an issue of structural injustice rather than of sinful bigotry. People within the church who mobilise on these issues are frequently from the so-called metropolitan elite. Those who have been educated at university level, are politically liberal and enjoy modest affluence. As a result, the church can be found to talk down to working class people, lecturing them on their bigotry. This is both missionally unhelpful and politically ineffective. This sort of suspicion towards the white working class runs the risk of reinforcing divisions in society by casting hardship as a zero-sum gain, relief as a zero-sum game. Our challenge is to find ways of ministering to the hardships of all simultaneously. Now, no one can fairly accuse the British Church of being indifferent on matters of food poverty, fuel poverty, human trafficking, and refugees. But projects working primarily for the relief of deprivation within traditional communities and those working for the benefit of refugees, asylum seekers, and other immigrants have tended to be managed by separate interest groups within the church. Interest groups which can tend to pit their priorities in opposition to one another. We need to find ways of joining up these equally valid concerns. Another part of this initiative, we need to facilitate the theological equipping and amplify the theological articulation of those Christian believers who live and operate within situations of marginalisation in the UK. Bluntly, we actually need to stop talking down to people and start exercising the Catholic social teaching of subsidiarity, which teaches us that decisions should be made at the lowest level possible. Seventh, we should attend to the rising problem of youth radicalisation by investing in youth work and youth programmes, especially those which enhance dialogue across religious and cultural boundaries. We should also train our young people in critical thinking and model those virtues in public and private conversation. We did a day on youth radicalisation on Saturday at Bloomsbury Baptist Church. And one of the most shocking statistics we were told was that the number of youth workers in training had dropped from 1,500 at the beginning per year, had dropped 1,500 at the beginning of the decade down to 53. Youth work is being completely defunded, not only by the government, but by the churches as well. And I know that the Church of England has just announced a £30 million input into this, but all the churches need to work together to help young people. Next, we need to think about the theological education we're giving people. So Ashley will know this as well. I teach in a Catholic seminary as well as teaching in my regular university. Helen is also a theological educator and she's director of theological education at Bristol Baptist. And these issues just aren't taken seriously in the education. Now, there are many pressures on ministerial formation. There's no doubting that. Whereas once aspiring clergy were trained in biblical languages, scripture and patristic theology, now they have an enormous range of concerns that they have to deal with. Safeguarding, leading change, pastoral counselling, pioneering, and 1,000 more things. But if we are tempted to water down the theological and biblical training of ministers and priests, we do so at great risk. This is one of the challenges that most, if not all, theological colleges are facing in the current UK climate, where previous funding models are falling out of favour, and where the much quoted line, "We've had enough of experts," is finding approval in parts of the church. There is clear evidence that those in our congregations who are regularly exposed to faithful, well-developed biblical teaching are less likely to show concerns of radicalisation and violence. And as we have already discussed, the true and good biblical themes which can be misapplied or misunderstood to great harm, I'm sure we could all name many, require wise and responsible handling by people who have deep roots in the scriptural and theological traditions of our faith. And one of the things that I will commend to you in the Catholic context is the Pastoral Review homily notes that are published every quarter, of which Ashley is the editor. Ninth, we should be faithful to the calling of the church, learning to express radical love and welcome, and conversely to stand against hatred and divisiveness in creative, non-violent ways. Ultimately, the complex of the far right with Christian theology is not a problem that can be solved with a set of practical suggestions. It is also a spiritual problem, which can only be corrected through spiritual means. The church is called to witness the teachings of Christ. Our calling is in continuity with that of the ancient prophets, to represent the truth of God by word and by deed. We are to witness in speech and action to the peaceful, just, and holy world that God is inaugurating. And at times, we may need to bear witness more publicly, more disruptively, and more boldly. So I give you an example of the Bishop of Dover, who spoke out publicly in support of protesters who had blocked coaches moving asylum seekers to the Bibby Stockholm detention barge. Such a stand may prove costly for her. I give you the example of the bishop in Washington, who spoke out at risk of her own life at Trump's inauguration service. We too, in our own small ways as lay people, can do this. The time may be coming when churches will need to unite across the denominations to issue a new statement like the South African Kairos document of 1986, to stand firm for the rights of the most marginalised in society. The time may come when we need to lay down our entitlement to gift aid in order to retain our ability to operate without government interference. And finally, what does Catholicism, and in particular Catholic social teaching, have to offer this problem? Now, Catholicism is not the only ecclesiology with resources to resist the rise of right-wing and nationalist politics. And if Helen were here, she would be talking about Baptist solutions. We all need to draw on the resources of our own denominational traditions. And in Catholicism, we have Catholic social teaching, which can guide us as we seek to determine the best way to respond. Catholic social teaching firmly resists the extremes and behaviours that right-wing and nationalistic politics promote, despite what Catholic integralists would tell us. Instead, it focuses on the dignity of the human person and the fact that we are all made in the image and likeness of God, Imago Dei. Therefore, to hate or other another human being is to hate or other God, in whose likeness and image we are made. Fundamentally, CST teaches us that we must care for the most vulnerable in our societies. And when thinking about far-right extremism, this has two consequences for us. First, we must care for the strangers in our midst, those that the far right seeks to vilify and banish. But second, we must actually also talk to the bandits. We must seek to understand why young people are becoming radicalized and what is it in our society that is making them so vulnerable to exploitation. This may seem counterintuitive, to care for those that spend their time hurting others, but as well as offering what Thomas Aquinas would call fraternal correction to them, we must also seek to deal with the problems, such as I said earlier, poverty and marginalisation, that make people susceptible to radicalisation. But as Jesus said in Matthew's Gospel, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. This fundamental truth is often overlooked by those who seek to employ power for their own theological agenda. That applies to both those who are promoting the ideologies of the far right and to many who seek to counter them. And one of the questions that we frequently get asked about this project is, why aren't you focusing on the far left as well? And the answer we give is that the centre that this work is coming out of is the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence. And the far right are the only ones weaponizing the Bible in this way and using scripture and religion to further their aims. The other part of the answer to that question is that the far left just aren't organized enough to create any threat to society. whereas the far right are, and they have much more funding and power, and we can see them getting into positions of power. But it is not by force or coercion that the kingdom of God grows, and is not by force or coercion that positive change will be realized. We cannot challenge the authoritarian tendencies and ideologies that we deplore ourselves by employing heavy-handed, top-down measures which belittle, deplatform, or intimidate. But the Bible teaches that change is possible when it is prayed in by the faithful, whispered in by the Spirit, and patiently nurtured by the church. To this end, it is grassroots actions which will count the most. Slow, patient contact and long-term investment in cross-cultural relationships, such as those I'm sure many of us are involved in. Patience will also be required for the necessary work of shaping hearts and minds of future ministers and priests in the process of theological education. And it is needed for the nurturing of generous, open-hearted young people who are secure in their own faith and warm towards those who do not share it or whose culture is different from their own. The week-by-week formation of the character of God's people is through the faithful preaching and exposition of God's word. But this is also a slow and patient business. But by patience and through small things, both Helen and I believe that this is how the kingdom goes and this is how the kingdom grows. And we have confidence that God, by his Spirit, continues to breathe life into the church, and he is calling it to be a prophetic presence in the world, no less in today's charged political climate than ever. Thank you very much. And just before I finish, we have a graphic with the 10 suggestions on it, which I'll put in the chat now for you. And if anybody would like a hard copy of it, please email me and I can send you one.
Thank you so much, Maria. That's tremendous. And it's a very good way of giving background on the book. In case people don't know the book, this is what it looks like. And I'm sure many of you have managed to get hold of it. But thank you so much for your address. And it's good that we've attracted a very big turnout for this meeting, certainly one of the biggest we've had in recent years. I have invited people to put questions in the chat, but you don't have to. But as I have to move from one screen to another to see the whole gallery, you need to put your hand up in the conventional way in Zoom rather than just hope that I'll see you. So any questions or comments? Oh, Christabel, welcome. Good to see you. You need to unmute yourself.
While you were talking, I was thinking about the initial point you were making about complicity.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's all too easy, presumably, for people who want to look back to periods such as those of the Crusades,
Mm-hmm.
to think that, and both for anti-Islam, the Saracens, and also for anti-Semitism, and how deeply ingrained that was, particularly the anti-Semitism. Well, it's never stopped. And that therefore there's an enormous amount of learning of history, but unlearning the attitudes to be done. And, I don't know how much of this can ever find a place within schools, not as part of, within the general education about not specific religions, but about mankind's development and attitude and reaching for the divine in many different ways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Christabel. That's a very kind of sharp observation. I'll start, although there is a question in here about education, which I'll come to in a moment. But I'll start by saying that actually I think too much responsibility has been put on schools in terms of children's education. Everything I'm speaking now from my own church, and I'd be interested to hear what's going on in other churches, but everything now seems to be thrown onto the school, and very little goes on in the parish. So, for example, in my parish, First Holy Communion and confirmation lessons are now done via Zoom, which to me is scandalous because you're not building community. And I think that in order to deal with unlearning attitudes, is that there needs to be more happening within parishes and within the institutional church, and not it all just thrown onto the school. So, we need to hear more about, I would say this, but we need to hear more about Catholic social teaching, for example, in Catholicism, in sermons. And I'm sure Ashley does a very good job at that, and you get it in Blackfriars as well. But we also, I think the thing that the church can give us is teach us how to think critically, and teach us how to think and teach us how to think through these issues for ourselves. And we know that the education system in the UK, any flavour of it, doesn't really allow for that. I see it in my godchildren's school. In the 2 years since my godchildren have gone to school, I see their questioning going down and down because they're not allowed to think at school because of just the way the education system is set up. So I think that's where the church can come in, is to help us think critically, but to help us use our Bibles and the church's teachings to think critically. Does that answer your question, Christabel?
I think what you're doing is probably to make a very strong point about the fact that actual teaching, but at the same time within teaching, allowing for questions, because it always seems to me that the important thing is allowing for questions, that should definitely be taken on board much more. Of course, the difficulty within, I can only speak for the Church of England and my experience there, the difficulty in achieving a situation where you've got children, not simply little children, but also children at secondary school level, is whether they are brought to church or not. And during the years since 1970, when I've lived here in Chiswick, where I do, and have attended the ancient parish church, when we first arrived in 1970, probably most people were here all the time. And when it came to the weekend, they went to Sunday school. They were sent to Sunday school, remember, sent to give their parents a break. Or they became part of the girls' brigade and the boys' brigade, or they became joined the choir, and they went away perhaps in the summer for a couple of Sundays. But now this place has been completely transformed, and many regular members of the congregation, and that includes families, may be here 1 or 2 Sundays in a month. And it's how to do it physically will be difficult.
Yes,
I think that when I was talking about schools, in a way, I was thinking much more about, as it were, the teaching through history. Do you see? Rather than
Yeah.
through whatever they call it. What do they call social development? You know,
PHSC or something.
Yes, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, Maria also dealt with, in a way, covered Blaylock's comment as well, which related to schools and church. Um, Maria, would you like to just comment on the question from Sarah Jane from Leuven, which is on the chat room, which moves slightly away from children?
Mhm. Could you please? I think that the church can, well, we've seen that some churches have become co-apologists to these positions, not least members of my own church. But I think that we as laity, as well as clergy, need to keep on pushing the idea of Imago Dei, that we are all completely equal in the eyes of the Lord. We are all made in his or her image and likeness, and we therefore all deserve respect. That's the message I keep on giving to the integralists, that's a really right-wing group in the Catholic Church that I'm frequently having to make contact with. So that would be my answer to that, Sarah Jane, is Imago Dei.
Thank you. Patricia, you've had your hand up for a bit.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Maria, for the talk. It was absolutely brilliant. I would like to know more about integralism, because judging from my social media feeds and conversations, it's taken a real hold in the United States. And I am wrestling with what it really means and how it works. So if you could explain a bit more about it, I'd find that very helpful.
Yeah, I'll try and do it quickly. It's something I find very painful, because
Yes.
it's because they say things like the Pope is a heretic. Basically, it's the idea that religion should control the state, more closely that the Catholic Church and its values should control the state. But it's a very kind of anti-democratic, anti kind of liberalism set of ideals, where women are expected to be in the home. It's based upon a kind of 1950s idea of its ideas on family, for example, are based upon 1950s ideas of the nuclear family, and the idea that the man should be the breadwinner, and the idea that anyone could earn enough to keep a family of four without both parents working. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. It's the idea that church values, but very right-wing church values, which oppress women, oppress minorities, oppress everyone that isn't a white male, basically, should be in charge of society and government. And it's not only taking hold in the US, it's taken hold of the Catholic Church in this country. So I went to a book launch a couple of weeks ago, and are we still being recorded?
Yes.
Oh, it doesn't matter. At one point, I thought, am I going to need to phone Prevent when I get home? Because I know the integralists are being watched quite closely by counterterrorism, because, and this answers, is that Alison's question? I'll just segue into your question, Alison. Integralists are people who are moving along the line of extremism, and they are giving fuel to violent extremists. So counterterrorism and the FBI, counterterrorism here and the FBI in the States are watching them very closely. And they actually are very active on Telegram, which is the place we all know that terrorists like to communicate with one another and radicalize one another.
Yeah. Do you think it's driven mostly by sort of nostalgia?
Yes.
Or does it have a more profound sort of political driver currently?
It's driven by people who believe that they are losing their power.
Yeah.
It's driven by a love of power, basically. It's not like what's that thing that Milbank? I can't
Radical
remember.
orthodoxy.
Yeah,
Yes.
Radical orthodoxy.
yeah, radical orthodoxy, which is nostalgia and which couldn't work. But this is driven by people who are terrified of losing their power
Yeah.
and have the means to violently get it back.
I think it does have points of contact with attitudes and movements in other churches. I've
Mm.
forgotten the man's name. If you know that he's a conservative evangelical financier, and he's very influential in the Church of England with links to Holy Trinity Brompton, but I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name. And he was quite close
Paul,
to the last Archbishop of Canterbury.
Paul
Um,
Marshall.
yes, that's right. Yes.
What is that? Yeah.
So, I mean, I think there are points of contact. Like, all I would say about integralists, and this might just be me, and in some ways I'm quite relieved by it, but I think it's disturbing. I think they're very careful about who they target, and they're very careful not to target clergy very much. I think they just keep away from priests whom they don't like, whereas they'll find lay people to be a softer target in
Yeah,
some contexts. Certainly, you know what's going on because you sense the sort of things that are being said, but they're quite careful in relation to clergy, and also because they're quite hierarchical. They like to show respect to clergy, even if they disagree with us. Now, I find this rather disturbing, but I think it probably is the case a bit in the Catholic community. Bonnie, you've got your hand up. Bonnie,
I was just going to add
oh, sorry.
something. Is and hello, Bonnie. How are you? Up until recently, under the last Regis, Professor of Moral Theology, integralism was the only form of Catholic social teaching that was taught.
Mm.
So in Oxford, in the University of Oxford.
And that's why he's been made a member of the House of Lords, presumably.
Yes, exactly. So anyway, sorry,
Don't
chatting
get me
away.
started on that, man. Bonnie, yes, your
Yes.
question.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's kind of a point for discussion as much as the question. I mean, a lot of these things. I was involved with an initiative with the UN Office for Genocide Prevention a number of years ago, and we had this is a long title: Global Plan of Action for Religious Leaders and Actors in Preventing Incitement to Atrocity. Oh, long one, but one of the main things that we were looking at, and this is across the globe. But particularly in North America and Europe, we were looking at the growth of the far right. Now, this was at a time when we had, everything that was happening in Syria and people going out to join ISIS and all of that. But our concern was the far right. And particularly with regard to grooming, I guess you could call it, of the younger generation. A lot of the things that we looked at it wasn't just about preaching in churches and what we're doing in churches, but about how we can work across the board, across faith identities, work together, show, demonstrate that we were talking to one another and we could actually be friends, but also going out and doing the youth work, doing things like chaplaincies, multi-faith chaplaincies in schools, and being open to listening to the questions from the young people. And all of this can make a big difference. The arts, particularly storytelling, theater, music, all of this can be used for making a real difference. I'd also like to make a point that, because it was mentioned about, not separating out the white working class. Absolutely. And that's partly because through my experience in working in this area is that it's actually I don't want to stereotype another group, but groups like UKIP and Reform and all of that, they use the white working class as their foot soldiers. And these tend to be very wealthy people, landed gentry, working in the City of London, not all City of London, okay, but investment bankers, that sort of thing. And this is personal experience, personal encounter with this particular group. So it's kind of like we have to know what we're up against, and actually in working with those people in working class areas, it's about supporting them and encouraging them so that they don't feel they have to depend on the more powerful. I'll just stop there, but I want to say thank you to Maria for your presentation. Very good, really good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just, Bonnie was one of the people that took part in the
All right.
in the event.
And thank you to points that Sarah Jane has made on the chat.
Yeah.
I just want to raise something myself, really arising out of the book. I know you've stressed the importance of grassroots work, and that's probably that's the only answer. In the book, you give a pretty that there isn't a very positive picture of the leadership of the churches. And I suppose those of us who occasionally are asked to advise bishops and people, though it's in a very limited way, should obviously be concerned about that. It may be that this is inevitable. It may also be the case at the moment that the leadership of churches is itself so morally compromised that perhaps it doesn't matter too much what they say. But it is disturbing that there seems to be a less sure-footed approach to some of the issues you've raised than there would have been about 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Are there anything you'd like to say about that?
I think you're right, and I think one of the things we've got to look at is not just those who are occasionally asked to advise, but those who are there as permanent advisors. We need to look at the people that they're surrounded with on a full-time basis. But I think, and this could just be nostalgia on my part, and please do challenge me if I'm starting to sound nostalgic. So I remember in the 1980s, people were much more sure-footed about politics in general. And I think that what we're seeing with the church leaders now is a change that's happening in wider society. So people aren't as politically engaged as they were, or if they are politically engaged, they are engaged through Twitter or Blue Sky, and they live by the algorithm. So they're not hearing all the different views in the way that would have been the case when you got your ideas from, I know, the newspaper you read, and that would be one-sided politically, but you would get your ideas from the news as well and reading. So I think that what we're seeing with the church leadership is a change in wider society. And I'm certainly always very, very surprised when I get a politically engaged student. I'm always overjoyed. But I'm very surprised when they appear. And so I've been teaching, 25 years? And that has changed over the last quarter of a century, I would say.
Yeah, that'd be my experience of undergraduates as well. I think you're right.
Look, there's a finger up.
Carolyn.
Sorry, I
Hello.
can't work out how to use the emoji, so my apologies. Thank you so much, Maria. I've really appreciated all that you've said. I've got two questions. I'm a priest in Switzerland. One question is around how you preach politics from the pulpit in a way that isn't a slanging match and calling out individuals, and is sticking to what you're talking about this Imago Dei, helping our communities to think more critically. And the second question is around if you've got any suggestion of good resources for young people, for our youth that you've talked about, which help engage with biblical text and church tradition in a way that helps them to think a bit more deeply about these things.
Okay, so my answer to the first question would be with difficulty, but I would say that you do that by going back to kind of a faithful interpretation of the Bible and the texts that you have for that week. And the other point I would make in that is by reading a range of biblical interpretations. So I know that my friends that are priests start by kind of reading different interpretations of the text that they have for that week in order to prepare themselves for the sermon. But they make sure that they read a kind of a political range, as it were. We shouldn't have a political range in our churches, but we do. So there we are. And it would be about, to me, it would be about trying to offer a balance of perspectives and not actually calling anyone out, remembering that everyone is a child of God, and constantly reminding people that we need to look behind a person's actions to think about their experiences and to understand why they're behaving the way they are. So at the root of everything, and I hope this doesn't sound corny, and I'm sorry, but at the root of everything, I would be preaching love and hope. I would constantly be preaching the love of God to people and the hope that the resurrection gives us for the future. Not only when we get to heaven, but also the hope that we have for the future on earth and the role that we have in building it. Yes. And the resources. I don't know of any, but if anyone finds any, I would love to see them. Maybe Helen and I should write some.
Yes.
Talking of resources, since Maria's already mentioned this, she's put in a plug for the journal, which I'm editor, and she's just finished co-writing some sermon reflections for Sundays with Raymond Friel, whom some of you will have heard of. So in journals like the Pastoral, we try to enable people to provide resources for others, particularly in relation to preaching. And I wrote a recent piece myself for the Preacher Journal about preaching and controversial issues. It wasn't necessarily politics, by one of the editors who clearly thought that I knew something about it. And all I would share from that, which I remember being told by somebody a long time ago, is that sometimes if you're saying anything controversial, you have to be very careful about examples you give, because sometimes people remember the examples rather than the core of what you're saying. So if you say something about King Charles III being one of the richest people in the world, that's the sort of thing people remember rather than anything else you say. So that's something most of us have to watch.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And just to say, Lat has put up a link to some resources.
Oh, right. Thank you very much. Yes.
Which I'm trying to open, but oh, Dorothy has her hand up.
And Andrew.
Okay, Dorothy, go ahead.
Dorothy, yes.
Unmute, yes. Hello. What a wonderful lot of things to think about that you've spoken to us about, and the slight frustration in thinking, how do we pass this information on? But just apart from being ourselves, placed where we are as lay people within a community of churches where I live in Malvern, where we do meet each other in an informal and formal way. But I'm particularly thinking of the people in Germany this week that are anxious about their coming election. And I was very moved to know that the German Kirchentag, which is some of you may know about, it's worth looking up to see what they're doing this year. There are, I think, 250 different events. And the very fact that last weekend was the special weekend within the churches, in the Protestant churches in Germany, when they were focusing on the themes of the Kirchentag. And so giving people a lot of diverse ways in which they can be involved in, well, I'd say church and society, just because I'm not sure how to say those words, but it's like not exactly frustration that we don't have something a bit more like that in this country, where we can people can go on a non-denominational way. Although it's very interesting just today to learn a bit about what you as Catholics think, as well as your diverse look at things. Anyhow, thank you very much. It's not an actual question, but it's just, I'm sure we're all praying and thinking about people, friends that we know in Germany, and hoping the love and hope that's there for this time.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. And Andrew Burden, yeah.
Really following on from what Dorothy's just said, actually, there are a number of people here with us today who are from all over the continent of Europe, and I would be very interested to hear their comments on what's going on in their place, apart from what's going on in Britain.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, this is a very good webinar in terms of people participating from all over Europe. So we're very grateful to those who've enabled our various networks to come together with people from Leuven, Luxembourg, and Norway. Any other points from the floor?
One or two from the Czech Republic as well.
Yeah, oh, right. Yes, of course. That's good.
Please, some of you.
Yes, Maureen.
I have great sympathy with all the things that have been said. I actually resigned from my post as an RE teacher, head of RE and school chaplain in a Catholic school, because I was so so fed up with the way Catholic social teaching and Catholic religious education per se was being slowly diminished, evaporated, and was certainly not useful. Can I just say that in my involvement in Catholic social teaching in the church as such started off in school with belonging to the young Christian students, and my family helped run the Young Christian Workers. So being brought up in Liverpool where there were unions and you know, people were fighting for their rights, it was natural that our family, my mother, her sisters, and then me, joined the Union of Catholic Mothers. And in the years of my early involvement in the Union of Catholic Mothers, our religious education was seen through the organization itself. When all of the church documents were being published, all the members of the Union of Catholic Mothers had study days. They learned what the church was teaching, and they realized that they had a responsibility to be aware of.
We seem to have lost you. Maureen, we can't hear you. You've gone mute. You need to unmute yourself.
All right, I've got devils in my computer room who won't let me speak.
It's dangerous people, yes.
Yeah, so so there has been Catholic education being going on within, dare I say, ordinary people in the church, through the voluntary organizations, through the groups of religious institutions, now the Union of Catholic Mothers, Catholic Women's Guild, the Catholic Men's Association, and the you know, people like the other men's associations. So that has been happening, but the numbers are declining, and we're not getting younger members. I would say that part of the problem is because we're losing that part of our constitutions, which tells us that we have a responsibility to actually be part of the religious education of our members and our families. So that's something that I'm aware of and I am concerned about. I'm also I'm the UK representative on the World Union of Catholic Women's Organisations. And we are very concerned at the World Union of Catholic Women's Organisations at the lack of religious education amongst all of our societies, and an apparent lack of interest in religion. So we are trying to encourage our members to be more aware of their responsibility to make sure that they educate themselves. I mean, it's all very well saying, you know, what is the church teaching? You know, what are the priests teaching? You know, what's going on in the parishes? We also have a responsibility to find out what we should be hearing and what should be happening. And so it's, in the past, as I said, it was done through the voluntary organizations who did this. And so for them, they are politically aware. I'm not talking about whether you're Conservative or a Labour. If we live in a democratic country, then as members of civil society, we have a right and a responsibility to be involved in what's going on and to make our voices heard. So much so, I'm also the Wellington New Catholic Mothers representative at the Council of Europe.
Yes.
And I'm on the on one of the committees there. So there are several committees at the Council of Europe who are concerned about human rights and individuals' rights and access to law. And they're becoming increasingly aware that we need to be all faiths, because you can't say it's only Christians that have the right answers. You know, all of the faiths believe in the respect for the individual and for society. And so we're trying to work together in faith groups to be able to see what we need to do to be able to make people aware of our responsibility as society to make the world a better place. It's a work in progress.
Thank you, Maureen. I mean, I imagine you said you resigned as a school chaplain. Was that some time ago?
Yes.
Right. I mean,
but I mean, since I've left, the decline in religious education I'm so glad that I did leave. In my early days of teaching, we had a group called the a group that was started by a head teacher in Southport who was concerned about theology and how are we going to train in secondary schools our young people to be leaders in the future. So we had a group called the Christian Theology Trust, and we had a special program for GCSE and for A levels, which was very successful. And in fact, some universities, when any of our students had an A level in Christian Theology Trust, from the Christian Theology Trust, actually accepted them on courses, because it was one of the, dare I say, nearly the only course that actually involved critical thinking. And certainly in my school, the English and history departments didn't look at the results from their own students if they were going to accept them on an A-level course. They came to the RE department and asked what the results of the religious education GCSEs were, because the students who had a good result in there were acceptable on courses like English and history because they were involved in critical thinking. They weren't just programmed through some syllabus that they had to show that they had studied. You know, they had to think for themselves and be prepared to show that they could think about it.
Thank you. I would say that, and I'm not here to defend the Catholic school system, but certainly in recent years, since the production of the new RE directory, a lot of work is being done to redress the situation you've addressed and put more social teaching into school curricula. And there's also a charity that I'm involved in called the Oscar Romero Award Trust that tries to do this, that you might have heard of. Richard has just
Can I just say, if you're looking for stuff for young people, Cathod had some excellent resources for young people.
That's very true. Thank you. Richard Seaborn has just mentioned Pope Francis' message to President Trump. I'm trying to put up the link to the letter that the Pope wrote to the American bishops last week. Yeah, I've just put it up in the chat. It's a brief letter that he wrote, and I'm sure across all the different churches represented here, people will want to pray for the Pope, who's, as you know, in hospital. Any other points?
Richard's got his hand up.
Oh, right. Yes. Sorry, go ahead. Yes, Richard.
Thank you indeed, Mariah, for that interesting talk. And it was very helpful. I think from my perspective, I would say that extremism, whether it's from the far right or from the far left, is a problem. And I think that needs to be recognised, whether it's far right or far left. Democracy only really works if the minority voice is heard and respected. And I think that can be an issue and can be a problem. I think also part of our difficulty is that some people are culturally Christian or culturally Muslim or culturally Hindu, but are not practicing. And that can be a big issue as well. They claim aspects of faith, but are not practicing their faith in any real terms. One other point that I just wanted to mention, you mentioned about funding of youth work. For most of my ministry, for the last 35 years, I've had to deal with paramilitaries on both sides of the Northern Ireland Divide. And funding for youth work is absolutely essential. And I'm glad that you raised that issue, Mariah. But part of the difficulty is, and churches, mainstream churches don't listen, certainly government will not listen. Youth work and community work needs staffing. We can get any amount of funding for programs. Program funding is easy, but actually getting funding for staffing is almost impossible. And so when I was in full-time parish ministry, we were having every year to lay off people who were essential in making a difference in local communities where terrorists operated. Just couldn't get funding for it. We get funding for a year, but no longer than that. Plenty of money for program, but no funding for staffing, and that is a huge issue in local communities, certainly in Northern Ireland, but I would imagine elsewhere in the United Kingdom. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard. No, I agree. And I was looking at the funding models, and it is terrible. And we can see that most youth work has gone voluntary now, which is, as people were saying on Saturday, has led to deprofessionalisation, which is quite problematic in itself.
Yes, I think that's it. It's very, very worrying. There's a question from Evelyn on the chat. Who are the people voting for far-right parties, young, middle-aged or older? I don't know the answer to that question. I think the really disturbing thing, as far as from what I've read, but others will know much more about this, is that there are probably more young people doing so than we had imagined. I don't know whether you know that, but I'm sure you know more about this, Maria, than I do.
It's actually a mix.
Right.
And I'm going to shock people now, but members of the Black community are also being radicalised and voting this way.
Yep.
I met one a couple of weeks ago, actually. I was very shocked. So it's a mixture, and yes, older people do need to be talk to, but it's the young people that are being radicalized into acts of violence. And so last year there was a young man who was radicalized into planning a suicide bombing in a synagogue, young white Christian male. So they're the most vulnerable. So that's why why we're focusing on them.
I think the point you made that you thought would shock people is important. As you know, Maria, certainly, some of the students that we teach on the Permanent Deacons program, which is linked to our social teaching degree, are from Nigerian backgrounds, and it's really important that the Catholic Church is at last attracting people for ordained ministry from particularly West African communities in parishes here in this country. But I think what we have found when we've addressed specific issues in social teaching, and this is, forgive me if this sounds, I don't want this to sound patronizing, but I think I'm simply making an observation. Quite often when you raise specific issues worldwide about which are addressed by social teaching, by social justice, what brings it back to anti-Muslim sentiment amongst some Christians from West African background is violence against Christians by Muslims in Nigeria and other parts of West Africa. And many of you will know about this. And this is the obviously people bring their own context to theological reflection, and we have to respect that. But I think it's part of the picture at the moment, and I suspect this is true across all the churches.
Just to add to that Pentecostalism and certain types of conservative evangelicalism are the ones kind of offering the religious fuel to these movements in many contexts.
Yeah. Torhild, welcome.
Hi. So I can only speak for the Norwegian context at the moment. There's some recent statistics showing there's a huge gender divide in Norway, where young women are increasingly moving to the left politically, and young men are moving towards the right. There was a huge backlash against the far right just after the terrorist attacks in 2011. So the mood has swung back. So we are seeing the same, we are seeing the same development that you see elsewhere in Europe as well, with young men turning towards the far right. And I think one of the biggest challenges for me is that I don't speak as effectively to young men as men do, as a woman. What we do have in my church, I'm an Anglican priest and I work in the Lutheran Church in Norway. What we have is youth ministry, where we've got a full-time youth minister who is organising what we call open church for young people, where they come straight from school, they get a hot meal, and we play chess and card games, and we have I would say young people from all strata of society joining us, just because, well, some come because they're bored and are going home to an empty house. Other people come because they're hungry, and some people just like to hang out in the church. So that's the grassroots. Well, I'd like to call it a measure. It's not, that sounds kind of official, but it's a grassroots event that we do every week, and I think it helps, because that gives me, as well as our full-time youth minister, who's a youngish man, which is wonderful. It gives us a chance to get to know the young people and talk to them, and I really do think you need to start on the grassroots level. Yeah, hopefully that will instill some values in the kids to come.
Thank you.
And I think as well, it's showing them love and showing them that someone cares about them. And I know, like from my experiences in West Belfast, the same thing has happened, and it's actually kind of led to a reduction in rioting and crime. But the statistics you cite about Norway, about the gender divide, aren't unusual. Hope Not Hate are just finishing up a report where they show that young men are significantly further to the right than young women, and it's misogyny that is driving this. So online influencers like Andrew Tate are actually forcing young men rightward through misogyny, which is very depressing. So, yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Bonnie, for the links you put up on the chat about work going on in Nigeria. A small question, Maria. Are you and Helen or others you've been working with, are you planning any further work in this area?
Yes. We're not quite sure what. We're talking around creating resources for people to use in schools. And again, to come back to young people, that's basically because we did the event on Saturday with young people. So that's what's fresh in my mind.
Right.
Resources for youth workers to use. And I think there might be a second edition of the book. But I don't know yet.
Well, that'd be good.
Yes, it would be. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All I would like to I'm working at the book. Published by SCM. I think it's quite. I think you can get it on Amazon, or it is very easy to get hold of, Maria, isn't it? The book. I'm sure I got mine easily.
Yeah, it's on the dreaded Amazon, but just go into any good bookshop and order it, or even better, get your libraries to order it.
Yes.
So,
if you're lucky enough to be in a university where the librarians still believe in books,
yeah,
they don't in my university.
I was thinking, oh, well, they don't in ours, but I was thinking about local libraries. Sarah Jane, if you email me, there's an e-copy, Sarah Jane, or if you email me, I can organise to post you one.
Thank you. If you go to the website of Faith in Europe, you'll be able to find out details of our future events, which will be made available soon. It's good to see so many. It's one of the biggest attendances we've had for a webinar for some time, I think. And please also, if you get involved in Faith in Europe, we welcome suggestions for briefing meetings for webinars. I'm sure there's a lot of expertise of people that have been in this room, and indeed from all over Europe. So it's really been good and encouraging. And there is a lot going on. I think the disturbing thing about so much of what's happening is that it is requiring us to react quite quickly to events moving fast. But the more we can do to support one another in prayer and solidarity, the better. So, Maria, thank you so much for all you've given this afternoon and for all you've done through the book. It's really been good and encouraging. Thank you all very much, everybody, and take care and God bless.